George Robert Twelves. Hughes crouched in the dark of a blacksmith's shop on the night of December 16, 1773, and worked coal dust into the creases of his hands until a labouring man's palms went black as a chimney back. He walked out to Griffin's Wharf in Boston, gripping a small hatchet he called a tomahawk, and he climbed aboard the Dartmouth. Before that low tide turned, 342 chests were split open, and more than 92,000 pounds of East India tea went over the rail. The men swung their axes, and the wooden chests broke apart like kindling on the deck. The water was low, and the loose leaves spread out across the harbour mudflats, like a whole barrel of spilled pepper. That was more tea than a working family would drink in 10 lifetimes, floating in the muck of Boston Harbour. Now here is a name to hold. George Hughes, a poor shoemaker who stood on that deck in a borrowed disguise and went home to a cold house. Whatever became of George Hughes, hold that question. I will get to it at the very end. Because tonight is not really about the tea they threw away. It is about the tea they brewed after. Today most folks could not brew a single honest cup from their own dooryard if the store shut on a Monday. You could walk your own fence line past a dozen plants that once filled a kettle and never know which leaf to pick. That is not a moral failing, friend. They are simply very good at their job. But here's the twist. Nobody outlawed the free tea growing in the fencerow. Nobody ever had to. The tea Hughes heaved into the water belonged to the British East India Company. It came in under the Tea Act of 1793, and it was the taxed leaf, the one the colonists swore off. Official British tea ran about 4 shillings and 1 penny a pound that year. For a skilled labourer, that was near a full day's wage for a single pound of dried leaf. So the colonists went looking for another cup. Some found it in the dooryard, and some, if I am honest with you, never switched at all. Here is the part the schoolbooks skip. The Dutch East India Company and the smuggling networks that fed off it sold the very same real leaf without the tax. Smuggled Dutch tea went for about 3 shillings a pound in 1773, a good quarter cheaper than the legal stuff on the King's Dock. Plenty of colonists never brewed a homegrown weed in their lives. They simply bought the cheaper real tea off a smuggler's boat and drank it right through the boycott. I will not stand here and tell you the whole coast emptied its teapots and took up wild leaves. That is not the truth. The boycott held hard in some ports and leaked like a cracked bucket in others, and real Dutch tea kept flowing the entire time. The homegrown cup was a choice, a proud one, but never the only one. Still, in kitchens up and down the colonies, people did learn to steep the plants under their feet. They gathered leaves from the fence line, dried them in the shade, and brewed a patriotic pot that owed nothing to any company or any crown. For a few short years, a free weed stood in for a luxury that cost a day's pay. And then the reason for it began to fade. The war ended, and real tea came sailing home. In 1784, a ship called the Empress of China left New York with a hold full of ginseng bound for Canton. She came back in the spring of 1785 with 800 chests of real China tea and a 25% return for the merchants who financed her. Legal tea was back, it was cheap again, and it was patriotic again, an American ship in an American trade. 100 years on, the last nail went in. In 1890, a man named Thomas Lipton walked into the Ceylon tea trade, bought his own estates, and built pre-measured packets sold direct from the garden to the teapot. He made a branded cup so cheap and so easy that gathering and drying your own leaves stopped being thrift. It became a hobby. Your people did not lose these plants to a law or a lock. They set them down the day the store made real tea cheap and easy again. That is the honest shape of it. No ban, no patent, no dark conspiracy. Homegrown Liberty tea simply lost its reason to exist, and a free weed from the fencerow slipped from a necessity into a folk memory. That is what I want to give back to you tonight. 17 of these old Liberty teas were printed in a Virginia newspaper 1 month after Hughes wiped that coal dust off his hands. 17 plants a colonial family could pick, dry and steep when the taxed leaf was floating in the harbour. Most of them still grow within a short walk of wherever you are sitting, and it all starts with a single price, the gap between what grew for free and what cost a fortune. So carry one number for me, friend, because it tells you how a free weed from the fencerow once stood toe-to-toe with a leaf that cost a labouring man a whole day's wage. So carry one number for me, friend, because it tells you how a free weed from the fencerow once stood toe-to-toe with a leaf that cost a labouring man a whole day's wage. The number is 17. On January 13th, 1774, 1 month to the week after the harbour went dark with tea, a writer signing himself Philo Alethias set his list down in the Virginia Gazette at Williamsburg. He named 17 homegrown teas a family could gather for nothing. 17 free teas standing against one taxed one. Think on that. 1 pound of legal British tea ran 4 shillings and a penny, near a full day's skilled wage. The list answered it with 17 plants growing wild in the hedgerows and the woodlots. Now let me tell you who I am. I'm Christopher Marin, and my family has worked this same patch of ground for 7 generations. I keep a thing on the shelf above the wood stove that I trust more than most books. It is my great-great-grandfather Samuel Marin's leather journal, cracked clean down the spine from handling, the way your grandfather's Bible cracks at the page he read most. The old ink went brown years back, but the notes on drying leaves dark still hold. Samuel wrote the way a man writes when he expects his grandchildren to try it, plain and slow, no wasted words. I have leaned on those pages my whole life. Before I get to the 7 plants, let me show you 2 I am holding back. Number 2, they did not tax it. They made it a federal crime in 1960, and I'm not touching that one until we are near the bottom of this list. And number 1 did not come back on a wagon. It came back on a ship in 1785 with 800 chests in the hold. 2 teas, both waiting. I'll get to them, not yet. I put the whole method, all 17 of these Liberty teas and the old way to dry them dark, into my book, Lost Plant Remedies, and you will find it in the link below. One more thing before we count. If you want these old ways to outlive both of us, subscribe. Not for me. So the next person hunting for a plant their family forgot has a place to land. That is all I will ask of you today. Now. Number 7. New Jersey tea. The botanists call it Ceanothus americanus. It sat right at the head of that Philo-Alethias list in 1774, and it earned the seat. 6 years before the harbour, in 1768, the Boston Gazette reported on a gathering up at Newburyport where folks brewed this very plant. They pronounced it nearly, if not quite, its equal in flavour to genuine Bohea. That is the real China tea they were measuring it against, and it near about passed. A wild root, measured against the finest leaf a ship could carry. Here is why it works in the cup. The USDA plant fact sheet, the one they file under the symbol CEM, puts 8% tannin in the root bark. 8%. That is where the astringent black tea bite comes from, that dry pull across the tongue. You will know the leaf when you find it. Broad and oblong, glossy on top, and 3 veins running palmate up from the base, like the tines of a hay fork. To take it, gather your leaves when the plant is in full bloom, early summer up north. Dry them in the shade, never the sun, so the colour and the flavour hold. Then steep like black tea, 1 tablespoon fresh or 1 teaspoon dried to the cup. Now hear this plain. New Jersey tea carries no caffeine, none. So it never was a stimulant. The payoff was patriotic and it was economic. Free from your own fencerow against 4 shillings a penny the pound for the taxed leaf. A day's wage saved every time the kettle went on. Samuel had a trick for it in that journal, the old colonial way of drying the leaves dark, and I will lay the full method out in a bit. Hold that thought. Number 6. Labrador tea. Rhododendron grow in Landicum, up in the cold country. This one was never the colonists' invention. The Dean, the Inuit, the Cree, and the Iroquois carried it long before any boycott, and northern settlers took it up as their freedom tea where New Jersey tea would not grow. Up where the winters are hard and the Ceanothus quits, this was the leaf in the pot. Now I am going to do something on this one that I do not enjoy doing. I am going to tell you what I do not know. I went looking for a numbered modern dosage, a toxicology study I could stand behind, and I did not find one in the time I had. And Labrador tea sits in a plant family with some toxic relatives, so I will not hand you a safe amount from this chair that I cannot source. That is the honest answer. Learn it from someone with the training before you brew it, not from a stranger who found no number. I did not turn up a colonial price for it either, so I will not invent one. That is 2 teas told, 5 to go, and the wild middle of the list is where it gets strange. That takes us back south to a golden-headed weed the colonial women once gathered by the armful, and it is number 5. That takes us back south to a golden-headed weed the colonial women once gathered by the armful, and it is number 5, goldenrod. Solidago odora, the sweet kind, brewed into what folks called Blue Mountain tea. Around 1774, with the East India leaf tax past reason, the women of the colonies walked the field edges and cut goldenrod by the double handful. They dried the flower heads until they went the colour of old straw, then they steeped them hot. and they had a cup that cost nothing but a morning's walk. Here is the documented turning point, and it carries an irony worth sitting with. This homegrown boycott tea, the one brewed to spite the British leaf, was itself later shipped back across the water. Goldenrod tea became one of America's earliest export goods, sold into England and the rest of Europe. The weed they gathered to declare independence turned around and sailed to the very country they were boycotting. Now, I have to be honest with you, the way your grandfather would want. I could not source a single numbered chemical study on sweet goldenrod tea, no modern market study, and no export dollar figure at all. The sources confirm the shipping happened. They do not give me the money, so I will not invent one. There is no real company to name here either. This was home gathering, not a corporation. The only firm in the story is the British East India Company, whose tax tea sent the women to the goldenrod in the first place. The how-to is plain. Cut the flowering tops when the plant is in full bloom, dry the flower heads and the leaves in the shade, then steep them as a hot infusion, the way you would any dried leaf. The payoff was the same as the whole list. Free if you walked out and gathered it, set against a shilling price you refused to pay. That is number 5. Goldenrod, the straw-coloured cup that boycotted a nation and then sold itself right back to it. Which brings us down to number 4, and this one was never the colonists' invention at all. Bee balm, Monarda didyma. The colonists called it Oswego tea, and they took that name straight from the Oswego River in New York. But the drink was not theirs to name. The Oswego people used this plant long before any settler put a kettle over a fire. Britannica confirms it. Oswego tea was a native-originated substitute, and the colonists adopted it during the boycott, the same as they adopted so much of what they learned from the people already here. You would know the plant on sight. The flower cluster sits scarlet and ragged at the top of the stem, bright as a struck match against the green. Crush a leaf and you get mint and citrus together. That is the cup. Steep the scarlet flowers and the leaves and you draw out a minty lemon-scented tea that needs no sugar to go down easy. I will be plain here too. I found no colonial price data specific to bee balm. None. So I cannot tell you what a pound fetched or what a pound saved. What I can tell you is that it grew wild across New York, and wild means free to the family that knew it. There is no company in this one. Just a river, a people, and a red flower the settlers borrowed. That is number 4. Oswego tea, the struck match of the tea table, older than the boycott that made it famous. And that carries us down to number 3, the one that walked off this list and straight into a birthing room. Raspberry leaf. Your people drank it 2 centuries back as a uterine tonic, and the midwives never once set it down. It carried from the Liberty tea lists all the way into modern midwifery. Evidence-based birth covered it in episode 139, and this is where the numbers finally show up. A randomized controlled trial of 192 women found no adverse effects to the mother or to the baby. The mean second stage of labour ran about 10 minutes shorter, and forceps use came in lower, 19.3% against 30.4%. Separately, a survey of 172 certified nurse midwives found that of the 90 who used herbal preparations, 63% of them recommended raspberry leaf. Now hold on, friend, because I owe you the caution far more than I owe you the sale. Do not call this a clinically proven labour aid. The researchers themselves describe the evidence as weak. No validated trial has ever tested that old uterine toning claim head-on. Midwifery convention introduces the tea no earlier than the 3rd trimester, roughly 30 to 36 weeks along, and that is a custom, not a proven safety line. If you are carrying a child, you talk to your own midwife before you steep a single leaf. The how-to is gentle. Dry the leaves in the shade, never in hard sun, and steep them as an infusion. You will see it sold today under brands like Traditional Medicinals, though I will flag that as low confidence, since I have not checked that name against a primary source myself. And the money on this one, I could not source a colonial price, and I could not source a modern per-pound figure either, so I will not hand you a number I do not actually have. That is number 3, the Liberty tea that outlived the revolution and still steeps in birthing rooms today. But the very next tea on this list carried a warning that the United States government itself would one day write into federal law, and that is number 2. So number 2 came off that very same list, and it carried the warning the government would one day sign into federal law. The United States Food and Drug Administration wrote it. Down south, colonists brewed sassafras, root bark, right alongside New Jersey tea and goldenrod, every one of them named on the Phyloalatheus list in the Virginia Gazette. You know the smell even if you have never dug the root. Crack that bark and it comes up sweet and dark, that root beer aroma rising like a soda fountain. Hold on to that smell. Because that smell is the compound, and the compound is the problem. Saffrol. In 1960, the FDA banned sassafras root bark and its oil, saffrol, from foods and drinks across the whole country. Not a company did this. Not a boycott. Not a rival brand. Not some quiet corporate hand. A federal rule, plain and public, friend. Here's the smoking gun. Saffrol fed to rats at 0.04 to 1.0% of their diet for 150 days out to 2 full years produced liver cancers, and some sassafras tea preparations, when they were tested, ran at roughly 4.5 times the permissible dose. So let me say this the hard way, because I will not soften it. Do not brew it. Not an old dose. Not a new dose. Not one traditional cup is safe to drink today. I will not hand you a recipe for a carcinogen and call it heritage. The money on this one I cannot give you honestly, because no colonial price was ever sourced for it. Yes, sassafras sailed out of Virginia as one of the earliest English exports back in the early 1600s, but that is a separate thread, more than a century before the boycott, and I will not braid the two together to make a tidier story than the truth allows, which brings us all the way down to number 1. And number 1 is not a weed at all. It is the real thing coming home, the Empress of China, financed by Robert Morris and a knot of New York and Philadelphia merchants who wanted back into legal tea. She left New York on February 27, 1784, carrying 30 tons of American ginseng, packed into 242 casks, bound for Canton on the far side of the world. She came home on May 11, 1785. In her hold rode 800 chests of real tea, 20,000 pairs of Nankin trousers, and a load of porcelain, and she paid her investors a 25% return. Picture those 800 chests riding home low in the hold like ballast. It was less than the backers had dreamed of, but it was enough. Within 20 years, American ships in the China trade outnumbered every other nations on Earth. That, friend, is what truly ended Liberty Tea. Not a ban, not a villain, fashion, and convenience. Then Thomas Lipton entered the Ceylon tea trade in 1890, working with the planter James Taylor, on an island that was already shipping about 45 million pounds of tea a year, after its coffee crop had collapsed to the Himalaya vastatrix fungus that took hold from 1869. Lipton graded it, packed it, priced it, and set it on every shelf from the tea garden to the teapot. Once real tea was cheap and legal, and no longer treason to drink, the wild cup went quiet. Nobody outlawed it. They just outsold it. A free weed became a folk memory, and that is the whole story of this list. So let me leave the one plant in your hands that is still worth carrying forward. New Jersey tea. Learn it by the leaf, and you will never mistake it. The leaves are glossy and broadly oblong, up to 3 inches long, with 3 conspicuous palmate veins running clean down the length of them, and white flower clusters that stand up in early summer. No dangerous look-alike, for it is documented anywhere I found, so I will not invent one just to frighten you. Gather it in full bloom, dry the leaves slow in the shade, never in full sun so they keep their colour, then steep 1 tablespoon of fresh leaf, or 1 teaspoon of dried, to a single cup, the same as you would a black tea. Now here is my question, and I read every answer. Of these 7, which one will you actually gather this coming year, and which one did your grandfather already know by name without a book? Tell me down below. The one that gets the most comments is the one I build next. None of this was ever your fault, neighbour. You were not lazy and you were not careless. You were handed a shelf, a brand, and a habit, and the plants slipped out of the family the same quiet way, one busy generation at a time. That is the real loss here. And it is also the one loss you can start taking back in a single afternoon, with nothing but your own 2 eyes and a patch of ground. And whatever became of George Hughes, the man who blackened his face at Griffin's Wharf that December night? He lived to be a very old man, old enough to sit down and remember, in his own plain words, the coal dust on his hands and the little hatchet he called a tomahawk. His first-hand account is the only reason I can tell you that detail at all tonight. Next time, we follow what Parliament did about all of it. The Boston Port Act, the wider coercive acts that slammed the harbour shut and set a fleet in front of the town. That is the road to war, and I mean to walk every mile of it with you. If tonight handed you back one plant your family used to know, do one small thing in return. Subscribe, so the next person who goes searching for the old ways finds them waiting here too. That is the whole reason I keep doing this. Keep the old ways, They kept us